The wind tore across the desolate prairie with a voice like mourning, rattling the shutters of the ranch house as Daniel Calloway returned from a long night of driving cattle through the storm, his boots heavy with mud, his coat drenched from the rain, his body yearning for the warmth of fire and the silence of solitude. Yet the moment he stepped onto his porch, he sensed something was wrong, a stillness too heavy, too unnatural. And when he pushed open the door, the fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving the air cold and damp, shadows crawling like spiders across the wooden floorboards. And there on the couch beneath, a rough wool blanket lay, the form of a woman he did not expect, a figure trembling faintly, her breath ragged, her presence as startling as a rattler's strike. For Daniel lived alone and had not opened his door to strangers in years. He approached slow, the weight of his revolver heavy at his hip, his hand instinctively hovering above it as his boots creaked against the planks. And when he reached the figure, he pulled back the blanket with a swift and wary motion, only to freeze in horror as the lantern light revealed her face. Pale and bloodless, her lips cracked, her eyes open yet staring not at him but through him, as though she saw into places no living soul should. And when she spoke, her voice was a rasping whisper that seemed dragged from the grave itself. "I'm already dead inside." Words that cut him deeper than any blade. Words that carried a truth and a pain that made his blood run cold. For though she breathed, though she trembled, her soul seemed shattered, hollow, broken beyond repair. Daniel's breath caught in his chest, his instinct screaming to demand answers. Yet something in her gaze held him still. Something that told him this was no ordinary woman, no simple trespasser, but someone who had walked through fire and shadow before finding her way to his ranch. She clutched the edge of the blanket with knuckles white, as though hiding more than her body, hiding secrets carved into her very flesh. And the longer he looked, the more he felt that beneath that wool, beneath the trembling frame, there was a story soaked in blood and sorrow waiting to be uncovered. A story that would change his life as surely as the storm had changed the land outside. And though every part of him told him to turn away, to cast her out before her darkness seeped into his home, Daniel could not move, could not speak, for the weight of her words bound him where he stood. And in that silence, he realized that whatever horror lay beneath that blanket, whatever past had driven her to whisper of death within life, it had chosen him, a solitary rancher who had thought he'd buried his own demons long ago, to face it. And with that realization came the first faint flicker of fear he had felt in years, a fear that would only grow as the night deepened and the blanket slipped further to reveal the truth. She carried like a curse across the endless plains. The storm outside raged into the night, wind clawing at the shutters, rain hammering against the roof like the relentless drums of war. Yet inside Daniel's ranch house, the silence between him and the stranger weighed heavier than the thunder. For she lay there on his worn couch, shivering under the wool blanket as though her body fought against more than the cold, her eyes unfocused but wide, carrying the distant look of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. And Daniel, standing over her with a lantern in one hand, felt torn between duty and dread, the rancher in him saying he could not turn away a soul in need, the man in him whispering that some souls brought curses heavier than the desert sun. And when she stirred again, her cracked lips moving faintly, he leaned closer and caught the words, Don't let them find me," a plea barely stronger than breath, and it made the hair at the back of his neck rise, for he did not know who they were. But the terror in her tone told him more than any explanation could, that shadows of flesh and blood were hunting her, and that by letting her into his home, he had already stepped into a battle not of his choosing. He poured her a cup of water, his calloused hand steady though his heart was not, and when he raised it to her lips, she drank greedily, coughing between swallows as if her body clung to the liquid like salvation. And then, with eyes still distant, she whispered, "It doesn't matter if you help me. I told you, I'm already dead inside." Words that cut deeper the second time, words that made Daniel wonder what sins, what grief, what horror had hollowed her out so completely. And as he studied her, he noticed the edge of the blanket shift, revealing a flash of her arm, mottled with bruises, scars carved like cruel signatures upon her skin. And he froze again, lantern light catching every mark, every story untold. And though she quickly pulled the blanket tighter around herself, as if ashamed, as if afraid of his gaze, Daniel had already seen enough to know. She was not merely a wanderer lost in the storm, but a survivor of something monstrous, something that walked on two legs and carried cruelty in its hands. He straightened slowly, his jaw tightening, the old anger in him stirring the anger of a man who had lost too much, buried too many beneath prairie soil. And though the woman's story was not yet told, though she had given him no name, no reason, Daniel felt a vow form in his chest, silent but unshakable, that whatever devils hunted her would not cross his threshold alive, not while he still drew breath. Outside, the wind howled like wolves and the prairie seemed endless. But inside, in the dim light of one rancher's home, two broken souls had met, one confessing she was already dead inside, the other realizing that for the first time in years, he felt alive with purpose, even if that purpose was born in blood and fear. And as he banked the fire back to life, as he settled into the chair opposite her, revolver resting on the table between them, Daniel knew the night was only beginning, and the horror under that blanket was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a trail that would test his heart, his past, and perhaps even his soul. The night crept toward dawn with the slow agony of a dying man, the storm easing into a drizzle, the winds calming as though the heavens themselves had grown weary. Yet inside Daniel Calloway's ranch the tension did not break, it thickened, every crackle of the fire and groan of the timbers sounding like omens of what was to come. For the stranger, this fragile woman who had whispered she was already dead inside now slept fitfully, her body jerking, lips muttering broken fragments of words Daniel could not piece together. And though he sat in the chair with his revolver in hand, his eyes fixed on her, he knew sleep would not touch him, not with questions clawing at the edges of his mind, questions about who she was, what torment had carved those scars into her skin, and who exactly hunted her across the endless prairie. When the first streaks of pale light stretched across the horizon, painting the rain-soaked land in cold silver, Daniel rose and stepped to the window, peering out at the wide expanse. And in that fragile hour between night and morning, he saw movement on the far ridge, three dark figures on horseback, silhouettes sharp against the gray sky, motionless as if carved from the stone itself, watching, waiting, and though they did not ride closer, Daniel felt the weight of their gaze even from a distance, a silent promise that the storm had only delivered the beginning, and the true reckoning had yet to arrive. He turned back to the woman, his jaw clenched, the old rage and sorrow burning in him, the memories of graves dug by his own hands rising like ghosts. And he thought of her words, "I'm already dead inside," and he wondered if she truly believed them, or if she clung to that phrase like a shield. For he had seen that look before in men broken by war, in widows who had lost their hearts to violence, and he knew that though one could live with a hollow soul, there was always a spark somewhere, hidden, waiting. And perhaps that was why fate had dragged her to his door. When she stirred awake, her eyes wide and wild as if she expected change to greet her, Daniel knelt beside her and spoke low, steady, the way he once spoke to frightened colts, telling her she was safe here, telling her no devil would cross his land and leave breathing. And for a moment, for the briefest flicker, he saw tears form in her eyes, not of weakness, but of disbelief, as though no one had spoken to her as a human in years. And though she turned away, clutching the blanket tighter, Daniel knew he had given her something the men on that ridge could never offer, hope. But outside, the riders remained, still as death, and Daniel understood that the prairie itself was holding its breath, waiting for the clash between a rancher haunted by his past and the shadows, determined to claim what lay broken on his couch. And as the sun began to rise blood-red across the horizon, he tightened his grip on the revolver and whispered a vow to the silence of his home, that if she truly was already dead inside, then by God, he would make certain those who had hollowed her would not walk this earth long enough to see her buried. The sun had barely lifted when the first shot cracked across the prairie, splintering wood from the post outside Daniel's barn, a warning as sharp as a rattler's strike. And in that moment the fragile silence of his ranch shattered, replaced by the truth he had already seen coming on the horizon. Those riders had not come to linger, they had come to take, and what they wanted lay trembling beneath the wool blanket on his couch. Daniel dragged her gently to the floorboards, his voice low but firm as he told her to stay down. And though her eyes blazed with terror, she clutched his sleeve for the first time, the strength in her grip shocking him, her whispered words slicing through the chaos. "If they take me, don't let me live." And though Daniel's chest ached at the weight of such a plea, his reply was a growl of defiance. "No one takes what's mine to protect, not while I'm breathing." And he rose with his revolver in hand, stepping out onto the porch as 3 riders advanced through the early light, their faces cruel and carved with the arrogance of men who had broken lives before, their voices taunting, asking him to hand over what wasn't his. And when Daniel refused, when his words cut the still air, "You'll find her in the ground before I give her to you," the men laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from devils certain of their victory. But Daniel had seen devils before, buried them under prairie dirt, and he knew that fear had no place here. The first man spurred his horse forward, rifle raised, and Daniel's revolver roared, the shot echoing across the valley as the rider toppled like a sack of wheat, his horse screaming and bolting, and the other two scattered for cover, bullets tearing splitters from Daniel's porch, the ranch erupting into a battlefield as smoke, fire, and fury swallowed the dawn. Inside, the woman pressed herself against the wall, the blanket slipping at last to reveal the truth she had hidden. Her body bore not just bruises but cruel brands, burned into her flesh, marks of ownership, of torment, of men who had carved her humanity away, piece by piece until she believed herself dead inside. And when she saw Daniel fighting, when she saw him stand unyielding in the doorway, she realized that for the first time in years, someone fought for her not as property, but as a soul worth saving. Daniel's shots rang out, his rage carrying his aim, and though a bullet grazed his arm, he held the line, his defiance unshakable until one rider fell and the other fled into the distance, shouting promises of vengeance that carried like thunder across the plains. But Daniel did not chase, for his fight was not for pride. It was for the trembling figure inside. And when he staggered back into the room, blood on his sleeve and smoke in his lungs, she reached for him with hands scarred yet trembling with new life, whispering through tears, "You should have let me go. I told you I was already dead." And Daniel, kneeling before her with fire in his eyes, answered with the voice of a man who had buried too much to let death claim another. "Not in my house, not while I've still got breath. You're not dead inside, not while you're still fighting." And though she sobbed, though her body trembled with years of chains and scars, for the first time she believed him. For the first time she saw that maybe, just maybe, her soul could be stitched back together on this broken land. And as the dawn light streamed through the bullet-riddled window, two survivors sat together, one who thought herself already gone, and one who refused to let her be, and both knew the West was not finished with them. But together they would face it, not as ghosts, but as the living. If this ending gripped your soul and made you feel the fire of survival burn in the dust of the Wild West, don't ride away. Hit that subscribe button right now, because more stories like this await you on the trail, and you won't want to miss the next ride.